Chapter 6. When Kane arrived home after work, he found his home empty and nothing cooking on the stove. He was still frustrated from the way his wife had acted that day, and he wanted her to be there so he could yell at her. He found a note from Berniece on the table and read it quickly, throwing it down. He heated up some of the soup she'd made, which was very hearty and exactly what he needed for a good meal, while he thought about what he wanted to do about the situation. As he ate 3 bowls of the delicious soup he'd criticized just a few hours before, he became angrier and angrier. How dare Berniece take his daughter and run off to town with her? Charlie and Abel had no right to keep the 2 of them from him. They were his family. As soon as he'd finished his 3rd bowl of the soup, he put the pot back in the icebox with the same towel she'd draped over it. He thought about leaving the dishes, but with all the work she'd gotten done in the house already, he felt like that would be a slap in the face. Instead, he washed out his bowl, his spoon, and the glass he'd had milk from and wiped them dry. And then he headed into town. He had something to say to his brother and sister-in-law. He drove into town in the wagon, fully expecting to collect his wife and child while he was there and bring them back to the ranch where they belonged. When he walked into his brother's house, he could hear laughter coming from the parlor. Female laughter. Apparently, Berniece wasn't as upset as she'd made it seem earlier. When he stepped into the parlor, he glared. "Get Ruth and your things. I'm taking you home." Berniece simply stared at him. "As soon as I feel welcome and as if it is my home, I'll consider it." She felt brave with Charlie beside her and Abel sitting in a chair in the same room. Ruth was already asleep for the night. "Abel, tell her she's leaving with me," Kane said, disbelieving his own eyes and ears. His wife was refusing to go home with him in front of other people. He had no idea what her problem was, but he wasn't pleased. At all. Abel slowly shook his head. "From what she and Charlie have told me, you don't deserve to have someone as nice as her as your wife. You need to remember how to speak to a woman with respect." "Are you kidding me?" Kane was shaking with anger. His own brother was taking his wife's side against him? That wasn't right. Charlie got to her feet and walked to him. "I'd like to speak with you alone for a moment, Kane. I hope you can spare me a few minutes." Her voice was soft and sweet, as it usually was, but he saw a hardness in her eyes that had him backing up a step. "Yes, ma'am. I think I could spare a moment or 2. "Come into my office," she said, grasping his upper arm and dragging him toward the kitchen. He grinned. Dragging might be a bit of an exaggeration. It was more of her tugging at him and him following along so his brother wouldn't clobber him later. Abel was older than he was, and he'd always been able to kick his butt. He didn't need to experience that in front of their wives, though. Once they were in the kitchen, Charlie let go of his arm and turned on him, her eyes full of fire. "Do you know anything at all about your wife? Do you have any idea how hard she's worked since she's arrived in Montana, all to try to make you happy and your surroundings habitable?" Kane shrugged. "She knew what she was getting into when she married me. My letter was very specific about what I needed from her." Charlie took a step closer to him, poking him in the middle of his chest with her pointy little finger. For such a delicate woman, he was surprised at just how savage her poke was. She didn't expect to spend her entire life paying for Veronica's sins, though, did she? She thinks you all but worshipped Veronica. You need to tell her about Ruth's mother, and you need to do it soon. And you need to start thanking her for the things she does for you. I'm tired of seeing her being treated like an indentured servant instead of like the lady she is." Kane folded his arms across his chest, trying to look tough, but mostly trying to protect his chest from her vicious little finger. "What? I should be thanking her for doing her job?" "Yes, you should. You should be thanking her every time she puts a meal on the table in front of you. Every time you have something clean to wear and something clean to eat from. Every time you don't have to change a diaper. Berniece is the best thing that has ever happened to you and that baby, And if you continue to treat her poorly, I will do everything I can to help her get an annulment and find a man who will provide well for her, and for Ruth. You wouldn't. Oh, I definitely would. I've watched how you've treated her for too long. An hour was too long. And now it's time for you to court your wife. She is staying here until she chooses to return to the ranch. Period. You may call on her after church tomorrow and perhaps take her for a drive or a picnic, or maybe even both. But you will not tell her what her duty is or take her for granted. Do you understand me? Charlie was on tiptoe by the end of her little speech, trying to make herself taller so she could scold him without feeling small. At least that's why he thought she was doing it. He shook his head. You seriously think I need to woo my wife? She nodded emphatically. Yes, I do. I think you need to treat her like she's the most beautiful woman you've ever laid eyes on. Treat her like you would have treated a beautiful woman who moved to town before you ever met Veronica. She sighed. I know you got a raw deal with your first wife. I knew that the moment I met her. But I also know that Berniece is absolutely nothing like Veronica. You need to give her a chance to show you how good a marriage can be. Do you know she's worried that you'll never come around and Ruth will be an only child like she was? She wants children. And my baby needs more cousins. Kane closed his eyes for a moment as he thought about what she'd said. All right. I'll do the right thing. And the right thing is? Charlie obviously didn't trust him to do what she'd told him. She needed him to spell out his plan for her. I will go in the parlor right now and ask her if she will take a drive with me tomorrow and perhaps fix a picnic lunch for us to share. He frowned. Will you watch Ruth if she agrees? I will be happy to watch Ruth. You know that. I love that little girl as if she was my own. All right. I'll go ask her now, but if she says no, I'm not sure what I'll do. He walked toward the parlor, feeling rather than seeing Charlie right on his heels. When he was in the parlor facing Berniece, he took his hat off and held it over his heart, as he'd been taught to do in polite company. Berniece, would you be willing to accompany me on a drive tomorrow? Berniece wanted to scream no at him, but Charlie was standing behind him nodding emphatically. She didn't have the option of saying no, apparently. Yes, I will do that. After church? Yes, after church. And if you would like, I'd be happy to stop for a picnic along the way. I'm afraid you'll have to fix the picnic, though, because I'm not much for cooking. It felt strange to Kane to ask to court his wife, but it felt right as well. Berniece was special, and Charlie was right. He hadn't given her a chance to prove herself. Instead, he'd assumed she was just like Veronica, and that wasn't fair to anyone. After a moment, Berniece nodded. I can do that. I'm not sure about taking the baby out, though. The winds have been high lately. Charlie has already agreed to watch Ruth for us while we're gone. He took a step toward her. I want you to know that I appreciate all the work you've done since you came to Montana, and I'm sorry that I haven't treated you better. I hope you're willing to start with a fresh slate tomorrow. Yes, I think starting fresh would be good for both of us. Will you walk me to the door? He asked, not sure why. He knew it would make Charlie happy, but more than that, it would make him happy. Berniece set whatever she'd been sewing, one of his shirts, it looked like, aside, and followed him to the front door. Was there something else you wanted to say? She asked him. He shook his head. No, but I wanted to let you know I'm not just apologizing because Charlie is making me. Maybe that's a small part of it, but I really am sorry for treating you so poorly since you arrived. Will you forgive me? She nodded, a slow smile on her face. Yes, I will. Besides, we're starting with a clean slate tomorrow, so no apologies are necessary. He grinned at that, leaning down and kissing her cheek. I'll see you at church in the morning, and I'd be honored if you and Ruth would sit by me. Berniece nodded. I'd be happy to. And she would. She would have Charlie to introduce her to the other women, and she would feel like she belonged as she sat holding Ruth beside him. I appreciate it. With those words, he left, and Berniece stood staring at the closed door behind him, a smile on her face. Maybe he was a good man after all. She returned to the parlor, a silly grin on her face, and she sat down on the sofa, picking up the shirt she'd been mending. As she worked on it, she was aware of Charlie and Abel watching her, but she said nothing. They didn't need to know what she was thinking about anyway. Asterisk. Berniece woke early to get the picnic ready for lunch and get Ruth ready for church. She put a beautiful gown on the baby, and it occurred to her someone had worked hard sewing for Ruth. She would need to take over that task as soon as she was caught up on everything else. When she got to church with Charlie and Abel, Kane was waiting beside his wagon, and he immediately offered her his arm. They walked into the church like a perfectly happy newlywed couple. It occurred to her that he probably wanted people to think they were doing well and had never argued, so she made a point of looking at him with a smile. She caught other women smiling at them as they headed to the pew they would share with Charlie and Abel. As soon as they were seated, Charlie began introducing Berniece to the people who came along. "This is my new sister-in-law. She came here to marry Kane." Charlie didn't add that she was a mail-order bride, which helped Berniece a bit. She didn't want the whole town to know her business anyway. It was enough that Charlie and Abel knew she and Kane had been fighting. As she met more and more women, Berniece began to feel a little overwhelmed. She'd only ever really attended the church that she'd grown up going to, so there were few strangers. This was a church entirely populated by strangers. As soon as everyone took their seats to begin the service, Berniece sighed with relief. "So glad that's over." Charlie laughed. "Most of the women in town are nice, but I don't really know many of them. Once Veronica died, it was easier to stick to myself and just spend time with Marianne and the baby." Kane returned to sit beside Berniece, and he smiled at her tentatively, as if he was still a little worried she'd be angry with him. "Clean slate, remember?" she whispered to him, and he grinned, nodding. "Clean slate. I couldn't ask for a better gift from my beautiful bride." Berniece blushed, having never been given a genuine compliment by a man before. It felt strange. After the service, they hurried out of the church, and Charlie took Ruth. "We'll take care of her. You two go have fun." Berniece nodded, smiling. "We won't be too terribly long." Though she wanted to be. This Kane seemed so different than the one she'd been getting to know since she arrived in Missoula. He helped her into the wagon and made sure she was comfortable before walking around and picking up the leads. "I thought a nice drive out of town would be good. We'll find a good spot for a picnic. How would you feel about eating beside the river?" he asked. "There's a river?" "I know so little about this place. I've only been to the Mercantile, the train station, the church, and Charlie's house. Everything else is a mystery to me." "Well, then I need to show you around the whole area. I hope you feel like a long drive." He smiled over at her, and she grinned back. The picnic basket was stowed in the back, and she gripped his arm as he drove. She could feel the ripples of muscles under it, and it caused a small flutter in her belly. He drove in a full circle around the city, stopping at the Bitterroot River. "We can picnic here." He pulled a quilt from the back and put the picnic basket in her hands. "I'll spread the quilt." She nodded, smiling at him. She'd had no idea her husband could be quite so charming. He'd kept up a steady stream of conversation on the drive, pointing out different sights and answering her questions. It was so much more pleasant than she'd imagined spending time with him could be. Once they were seated, she pulled out 2 ears of corn and the fried chicken she'd made for them. "It won't be hot now, but it should still be good." "I'm sure it's fine." He reached into the picnic basket for one of the jars of water she'd added in, and he unscrewed the lid, tilting his head back and drinking. A lone trickle of water rolled down the length of his throat, and all she could think about was licking it off his skin. She blinked a couple of times, forcing herself to look away. She wasn't even sure where that thought had come from. Keeping her eyes on the chicken, she took a bite and smiled. Even though it wasn't hot, it was still warm, and the food was good. They ate through everything she'd brought, including a dozen chocolate chip cookies, mostly in silence. She desperately wanted to ask him about Veronica after what Charlie had said the previous day, but she wasn't sure how he'd react. Finally, she found her courage and looked at him. "Tell me about your first marriage." He frowned, looking down at his hands for a moment. "I'm not quite ready to talk about Veronica yet." "All right." She looked away, wishing he wasn't keeping secrets from her. Veronica's name had been mentioned a couple of times at church, and she felt as if the whole town knew some sort of secret that she could only guess at. He reached over and covered her hand with his. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to hide anything from you, but I'm just not ready to discuss her." "I know that's strange." She simply nodded, wishing things were different between them and she could get him to tell her whatever everyone else knew. He moved toward her on the quilt, looking deeply into her eyes. "I really am sorry." She shrugged. "I guess if you can't talk about it, then you can't. Maybe someday." She thought for a moment about asking around town, but if he didn't want her to know about Veronica, then she would wait until he did. Yes, there were ways of figuring things out, but at that moment, she knew it was more important for her to trust him. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. "When you are ready to talk, I'll be here." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, finding affection with her a great deal easier than he'd expected. She felt right to him in a way that Veronica never had. He rested his cheek atop her head for a moment when something caught his eye. "Stay very still," he said softly, reaching for the gun he always wore at his hip. He knew some said you shouldn't wear a gun to church, but he couldn't not wear one. It frightened him just thinking about it. Berniece moved closer to him, nervous about what must be behind her for him to act so peculiarly. She was afraid, plain and simple. He pulled the gun and fired 2 shots. The first went into the rattlesnake's head, and the second cut it in half. When she turned and saw the dead snake, she gasped, shaking her head and throwing herself into his arms. Chapter 7. Kane wrapped his arms around his wife, holding her close. He found himself thankful for the snake, because it had made Berniece move closer to him. He looked down at her, tilting her chin up to his, not surprised when he saw tears on her cheeks. "It's okay." She took deep, gulping breaths, before nodding. "Thank you for saving me." "Happy to do it. Especially since it brought you so close." He wiggled his eyebrows a little to make her laugh, which she did. "I think I'm done sitting on the ground for our picnic for the moment." "I can understand that. Do you want to drive for a little more, or should I get you back to Abel's house?" Berniece looked up at him, pursing her lips as she considered the question. "Why don't we get Ruth from Abel's and go home?" Because suddenly, it did feel like home. There were still secrets between them, but they would be taken care of when the time was right. At least after this sweet time together, she had a hope that the time would eventually be right, and she wouldn't need to continue worrying about her future. He smiled and nodded. "I'd like that a lot. And I'm not going to take you and all you do for me for granted anymore. I promise you that." "Thank you." Berniece didn't feel the need to say anything else on the subject. They had a clean slate. "Let's go get our baby girl." Kane grinned. "I think you already do think of her as yours, don't you?" She nodded emphatically. "I do. I came here to be her mommy, and that's what I intend to be." "So, you're what? A mail-order mommy?" "Well, I'm certainly not much of a mail-order bride. We do keep separate bedrooms after all." She got to her feet and started to clear away the remains of their picnic, putting the refuse and dirty dishes into the basket. She would make sure she cleaned them for Charlie before they went home to the ranch. "Do you want to share a room?" he asked, looking perplexed. "I honestly thought I was doing you a favor by not sharing a room with you. For now, I think it's good. I would like more children eventually, though. Little Ruth doesn't need to be an only child forever." He stood up and folded the quilt they'd used for the picnic. "Then let's plan on sharing a room whenever you're ready." Berniece carried the basket and the sloppily folded quilt to put them into the back of the wagon. "I thought you found me repulsive," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Repulsive? Why would you even think that?" Kane caught her shoulders before she could run over and get into the wagon. "I think you're one of the prettiest women I've ever met." "Then why did you only kiss my cheek at the wedding?" "I thought for sure we'd kiss our first time after we were pronounced man and wife, but instead, you just kissed my cheek. It made me feel ugly." He shook his head, feeling like the world's biggest heel. "I'm so sorry. I didn't intend to have a real marriage with you, and I was planning on treating you like a maid. Which I did for a day or two, if you'll recall. I didn't kiss you, because you shouldn't kiss your maid." He looked deeply into her eyes for a moment. "Are you sure you want to be a wife and not a hired servant?" Berniece nodded emphatically. "I'm positive." Kane needed no further invitation. He pulled her to him by the hands that were still gripping her shoulders and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss he gave her was soft and tentative. This woman was nothing like Veronica, and she deserved to be treated well. Berniece wrapped her arms around his shoulders, surprising herself. She was actually enjoying this kiss, when she'd loathed every kiss she'd received before. She moved closer to him, flattening her breasts against the hard wall of his chest and opening her mouth for him. Together, they held one another and explored, forgetting the past few days of frustration with each other and only thinking about how the other felt against them. Kane lifted his head after a long moment. "I think I like kissing you, Mrs. Burton." She smiled, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "I know I like being kissed by you, Mr. Burton." He took her hand and pulled her to the side of the wagon, taking her by the waist and easily lifting her into the wagon. "Let's go get our baby, so we can go home." "I'd like nothing more," she said, her eyes full of warmth. She wanted to spend the rest of the day with him, but at their home and not out where they could be stumbled upon by anyone. She liked the intimacy of kissing him, and she didn't want to become a public spectacle. When they arrived to pick up Ruth, she was sleeping, so Berniece took care of the picnic basket, returning it in perfect condition. She waited until Kane had gone off to speak with Abel before refolding the quilt properly and giving it to Charlie. "I couldn't let you take it back with the way it was so sloppily folded," she whispered. Charlie laughed. "Kane must have helped." "He did. In his own special way." Charlie grinned. "He's been a good brother to me. I shouldn't poke fun. Today was lovely. We went for a long drive, and then we had a picnic. He shot a rattlesnake that was inches from me, and that was fun." Berniece gave a little shudder as she told her friend what had happened. "He what? It didn't get you, did it?" Charlie looked at her friend as if she was trying to spot a snake bite. "No, I'm fine, but I was a little rattled." Charlie laughed appropriately. "I can't believe you're making jokes about it so soon. I think it would take me a great deal longer to get over my initial shock." "Oh, trust me. I'm still shaking a little." Berniece shook her head. "I feel like Kane and I are getting stronger together. This was a good move for me, though I wasn't sure how it would turn out. I think you did what you needed to do. If he starts taking you for granted now, he's never going to stop." Charlie shook her head. "You are definitely doing the right thing for your future as his wife." Charlie brought Ruth down the stairs a few minutes later, handing her off to her father. The baby looked at her father and patted his cheek happily. It was obvious they had truly bonded during the time they'd had to live apart. On the drive home, Berniece held the baby, who babbled constantly and incoherently. "She's in a good mood," Berniece said with a grin. Kane laughed. "I'm not sure I've ever heard her be quite so verbal unless she was crying." "I like it." "I do, too." Berniece kissed the top of the baby's head. "I can't wait until she really starts talking." "I can't either. I'm told we'll want her to be quiet as soon as she can speak, but I'm not sure I believe that." Kane glanced over at his new wife, holding his daughter, and he felt his heart swell. It truly didn't matter if he thought she was the most beautiful woman on earth. What mattered most to him was how she treated Ruth, and she had already claimed Ruth as her own child. He couldn't have been happier with his choice of brides at that moment. And soon they would learn about each other in a more intimate way. For now, they could simply learn to talk to one another about anything and everything as a way to become closer. "Do you have any siblings?" Berniece was surprised by the question, but she immediately shook her head. "No, I don't." "I'm sorry to hear that. I'd have had a horrible time this past year if not for my brother. It wasn't easy even with my brother and his wife's help." She nodded. "I think I would love to have a sibling. My parents' marriage always felt strange to me, with my mother afraid to contradict my father in any way. I think I understand now. More than I ever dreamed I would understand." Albert Chase had taught her a great deal more than she wanted to know about the negative side of some marriages, and they hadn't even made it to the altar. In what way? Kane knew so little about the woman sitting beside him. The more he learned, the better he felt like they would do together. "Well, my father bragged to Mr. Chase, the man I was supposed to marry, about how much fun it had been teaching my mother her place early in marriage. And then he went on to say that he still spanked her from time to time so she would remember, not because she needed it any longer." She shook her head. "I cannot believe my mother would stay with a man who treated her that way. And I was appalled she wouldn't help me to avoid a marriage like hers. She honestly thought that's how a marriage should be for some absurd reason. I promise you I will never treat you like that. Why did your father want you to marry a man who would beat you?" "My father thinks women have a weaker mind and must be disciplined. Mr. Chase has been his boss for as long as I can remember, and when he expressed an interest in me, father knew that he would not spare the rod. That pleased him." "That's terrible." Kane shook his head. "I'm so thankful I didn't grow up in a household like that." He glanced at the baby, who was still babbling happily. "And I cannot imagine marrying a woman who would hit my child. I want to protect her from everything." Berniece looked down at little Ruth and nodded. "I want to keep her safe. From the first moment I saw her, I knew it was my job and my responsibility to make sure she never courted a man like Albert Chase." "What did you like to do back in Beckham?" he asked. She shrugged. "I volunteered in our local orphanage before I was engaged. I liked that a great deal. I had a few friends who I liked to sit and chat with, but they all married and moved on. I guess I was kind of waiting for my life to start. Oh, and I like to read. A lot. I would read every book I could get my hands on, from poetry to novels to medical treatises. I just like to read." "I didn't know that." Kane smiled to himself. He would find her a book or two to commemorate their marriage. Who said he had to wait a year to celebrate anything? "Yes, what about you? What do you like to do when you have a little spare time?" He laughed ruefully. "I haven't had any spare time in a long while. When I was married to Veronica, we had to go to town for supper every night because she didn't cook. So, I'd work all day, and then we'd walk into town, and by the time we got home from supper, it was time for bed. On Sundays we'd stay in town all day so we could go out after church and still be there for supper. And then after Ruth was born, I was spending every moment I had with her. Someday, I'll remember what I like to do when I have some spare time, but it won't be soon." Can you hire another man to help out around the ranch? She asked. He shook his head. I've hired a lot of extra men, and I find that I just work more to manage them all. No, I need to just take Sundays as relaxation days now. And I have evenings again, because you're cooking and not making me go all the way into town. He shrugged. Trust me, you being here is more help to me than I could possibly express. I'm really glad. I read your letter as a cry for help. And it was. Kane sighed. I didn't want to be so transparent, but yes, it was. I needed the baby to live with me. I'd been taking advantage of Abel and Charlie for too long. And I was afraid her first word would be Dada, and she'd be talking about Abel, not me. It would have broken my heart into a million tiny little pieces. I'm sure it would have. She hugged the baby to her. I hope her first word is Mama, and she means me. Or Mommy. That would make me even happier. You want to be called Mommy? He asked. She nodded. I think so. I called my mother Mama, but I feel a little betrayed by her. I know she's in a tough situation, but I won't do that to our Ruth, even if I'm in a tough situation. I would take 100 beatings before I'd let someone lay one finger on her. Her heart was already overflowing with love for little Ruth. Thank you, he said softly, surprising her. Thanks for what? She asked. She hadn't expected the words from him at that moment, and she wasn't at all certain what he was referring to. Thank you for taking one look at my little girl and making her your own. I don't think I realized just what I had in you until today. Don't change, please. He felt a flash of guilt for the way he'd spoken to her, but he could do nothing other than apologize, and he'd done that. He would do better in future. Berniece smiled at that. I'll do my very best. Once they were home, she set about fixing supper, and then joined Kane and Ruth in the parlor, where they were playing together. She carried the only book she'd had room for on the train, and she opened it up to read it for the 30th time. The train ride had been long, and she was a particularly fast reader. Have you read that book before? He asked. She nodded. It was the only book I had on the train. He handed her the baby and left the room for a moment, coming back with 3 books. Now these are all I have at the moment, but I'm a particular fan of poetry. Maybe you could read some of them aloud while I hold the baby? She grinned. I would enjoy that more than words can express. She flipped open the book of verses and started on the first. She read aloud, thoroughly excited to share her love of literature with her new family. She wanted little Ruth to be a reader and would start teaching her as soon as she felt the little girl was ready. More than 2 hours went by with her reading, and she finally stopped and cleared her throat loudly. I am going to completely lose my voice if I keep going. Maybe after supper, you could read some? I would enjoy that. As they ate, Berniece kept stealing looks at him in between taking bites and feeding the baby. For the first time since she'd met him, she was hopeful for the future. She was going to fall in love with him. She could feel it. Chapter 8. For the next week, Berniece spent her days alone with little Ruth and her evenings with her new husband. She and Kane were getting more and more comfortable with each other. Berniece completely caught up on the laundry and had moved on to scrubbing the walls and floors upstairs. On Saturday, she made the butter she'd been promising herself she'd make, and her arms were aching when Kane got home that evening. She had made a pot roast, mashed potatoes, and carrots, along with freshly buttered bread. Kane walked in the door and inhaled deeply before going to the basin to wash his hands. You are spoiling me, Berniece. I might just start expecting you to do nice things for me. He grinned at her, letting her know he was only half serious. She laughed, shaking her head. A woman cooking dinner for her husband is not spoiling. It's her doing her job. He frowned. I'm sorry I ever treated you that way. I don't think it's your job, but I'm so happy you do it willingly. Ruth was in her high chair, and as soon as his hands were washed, he lifted her out. "How was your day? Did your new mommy treat you well?" Ruth babbled in response and did it very animatedly. "I think she's just days from crawling," Berniece said. She was on her hands and knees rocking back and forth as if she was trying to figure out exactly how to do it. Of course, Charlie thought she was really close to crawling for a full month before I got here. He grinned down at Ruth. "Are you trying to crawl? Now don't you do it for the first time while Daddy is working. I need to see you crawl." Ruth responded by patting his cheek. "I think that is meant condescendingly," Berniece said. It was very much a "you'll take what you can get" pat. "I'm worried you're right," Kane said, shaking his head. "I do want her to crawl when I'm around, but I know there will be things I miss unless I stop working, and that wouldn't be smart. I'll do my best to write down the time of every new thing and describe it as well as I can. It's as close as I can get to actually being there for you. I wish I was a photographer." He grinned. "I wish you were, too." I have a feeling that Ruth would find it impossible to stay still for long enough to have her portrait taken. Maybe in a year or two. Berniece put supper on the table, including freshly cut bread. "Would you mind giving her the heel of the loaf so she can start gnawing on it and we can actually eat a few bites before she starts demanding real food?" He laughed. "I can do that." He put the baby into her high chair and handed her the heel, watching as she started sucking on it greedily. "I like being able to help out with her a little. Do you know that until Marianne and Charlie started trying her on infant food, I'd never even been able to feed her? I've never diapered her. Maybe you could teach me." She nodded. "I'd be happy to. I wouldn't mind a break from the diapers on occasion. They are not my favorite part of being a mommy, I must say." "I'm sure they're not, and if I can help with them, I will. I was so excited to have a child, and I feel like I've gotten so little time with her since she was born. You're making it a lot easier for me. I'm happy to do that." She took her seat and bowed her head for their prayer, and then she served them both a plate. She took a bit of the carrots and mashed them the best she could with her fork, and then stirred in the mashed potatoes for the baby, setting the bowl aside for the food to cool, while she ate a few bites and the baby gnawed at her bread. As they ate, Kane told her about the new area they were moving the herd to. "We finally finished mending the fences near the river, so we're moving the herd down that way on Monday. It's going to be a long process, and all of us will have to work together, but I think we can get it done in a day or two. I would love to see the whole ranch. Do you know I've lived here for more than a week and never seen the property?" He shook his head. "I've been remiss. Perhaps we can convince Charlie to watch Ruth tomorrow after church, and the two of us can explore the ranch together." "I'd like that." "Will you have to go on a cattle drive?" she asked, having read about ranches in the West. She'd read about everything. "I won't go this year, and I didn't last year. When Veronica was pregnant, she wanted me around, and I won't leave my new wife and baby for that long. My ranch foreman will be the one to lead the cattle drive into Billings, which will leave me here with just a couple of hands for a few weeks, but we can get the work done with fewer cattle. Will there be someone left to cook for the men? Or should I plan on having a couple of extra mouths to feed every night? It wouldn't be any extra trouble to make more." He shook his head. "The men that are left will take care of themselves. There's a bunkhouse, and they will take turns making bad food for each other." She laughed. "Works for me. I can also cook extra, and you can take it to them. Then they won't have to eat their bad food." "I don't think so. There are times when a man doesn't want his employees close to his beautiful wife. Until he was sure of how she felt about him, he wanted to lock her up and not let her be around other men at all. How had he ever thought this could be a business arrangement? Beautiful?" Berniece felt her heart skip a beat. He was a sweet talker now that he'd decided to be kind, and she wasn't always sure how to take his words. If you change your mind, let me know, and I'm happy to help out. I will. He thought about how Veronica would have yelled at him if he'd even considered asking her to help out by cooking for the ranch hands, and he was happy that he'd found someone as willing to help out as Berniece was. She was a much better wife to him already than Veronica ever had been. I'm sorry, but I didn't get around to making a dessert today like I'd planned, she said, shaking her head. I made butter instead, and my arms are just aching from all the churning. I'm sure I'll get used to it in time, but for now, I don't ever want to even think about lifting a finger ever again. He laughed. I'll help with dishes tonight. Oh, no. I couldn't ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I offered. She shook her head. No, you spent all day working, so I can buy food from the store. It's my job to cook that food and clean up after we've eaten it. You play with Ruth, and I'll give her a bath once I've finished with the dishes. May I help bathe her? I've never been around for that. Of course. She grinned at him. I'm just going to bathe her in the basin I wash dishes in. I love our bathtub, but she's still too little to sit up, and it wouldn't be wise to bathe her in it. Kane smiled. How do you know so much about children? I volunteered at our local orphanage from the time I graduated from the 8th grade. I helped give the children baths, and even got to teach a few of them to read. I changed a lot of diapers there, too. It was a really good experience for me, and I was devastated when my father made me stop helping out. She fed the baby another bite of the mashed up carrots and potatoes, giggling at the way she opened her mouth like a baby bird, waiting for a worm. She loves this. She does. She recognizes exceptional cooking already. Berniece was surprised at the absolute change Kane had made in the week since she'd left overnight. It really had been the right thing to do for their marriage. I'm glad you enjoy my cooking, but carrots and mashed potatoes are very simple. I did some of that for the orphans as well. And laundry. I think I did more laundry there than anything else. Did your parents encourage you to volunteer? Or was it something you wanted to do? It sounded like she'd done all the household chores by choice that Veronica had considered beneath her. The more he learned about his sweet new wife, the more he realized he had found someone who was just like he'd thought Veronica was when he married her. My mother didn't mind, but my father kept telling me I should be spending my days looking for a husband. I felt like I was too young to look for a husband, and my mother indulged me. I don't think that's indulging. That's being reasonable. A woman is not ready to marry until she's a little older. Berniece smiled and nodded. I'm 19, in case you were wondering, and I think that's a good age for marriage. I'm 26, he said softly. I feel like I'm an old man compared to you. How old was Veronica? She asked casually, hoping he would tell her something about the other woman. What she'd heard so far had made her think Veronica hadn't been a good wife to him, and he was expecting her to act the same. She was 21, which is older than you, but she was spoiled and had never worked a day in her life. Kane regretted the words as soon as they were spoken. I see. Berniece didn't meet his eyes. Well, you don't have to worry about that with me. My father called me spoiled, but I certainly know how to work, and I'd rather be busy than idle. Well, unless I have a new book, in which case I can be positively lazy. He laughed. I think if you weren't lazy with a new book, you wouldn't be human. He was glad she hadn't latched onto what he'd said about Veronica and had quickly changed the topic. He didn't feel like he should be saying bad things about his late wife, but the truth was, he'd been miserable as soon as they'd said, I do. I'm so glad you understand. She grinned at him as she fed the baby the last of the food she'd made for her. If you'll watch Ruth, I'll get the dishes done and then draw her bath for her. Happy to do it. He'd had 3 plates of food in the time it had taken Berniece to eat one herself and feed the baby. He scooped the baby out of the chair and wandered into the parlor with her, putting her on her tummy. He wanted to see if she'd crawl for him so he wouldn't miss it while he was working. Crawl, Ruth. Berniece laughed to herself in the kitchen as she heard him tell the baby to crawl. She knew he desperately wanted to have a bigger part in his little girl's life, and she daydreamed about how he would be with their children. Of course, they hadn't yet done anything to make a baby, but they were growing closer, and she was hopeful. Ruth really didn't need to spend her entire life as an only child as Berniece had. She washed and dried the dishes quickly while she heated water for the baby's bath. When she had the water just right, she called for Kane to bring Ruth in. "Did she crawl for you?" Berniece asked him. He shook his head with a frown. "I think she's deliberately holding back so I won't see it." Berniece laughed. "You are being downright silly, Kane. She doesn't know to do that to you." He shrugged. "Hopefully she'll crawl for me tomorrow. Then I'll feel like I've seen one of her firsts." "You'll see plenty of them. Don't worry about that." Berniece took the baby from him and stripped her quickly, putting her in the water and holding her up with a hand behind her head. She picked up a piece of mild soap she'd purchased from the mercantile in town and rubbed it over the baby, carefully washing her hair. When she was done with actually cleaning her, she stepped to one side, while still holding the baby's head up. "Now you can hold her head while she splashes." Kane put his hand just where Berniece had hers, and then he watched as Ruth kicked and giggled. "She likes the water." She nodded. "She really does. I forgot to get her diaper and gown. I'll be right back." She hurried up the stairs and carried down one of the baby's long white gowns that had been trimmed with lace. She had made a couple of rompers for the baby that week, so when she was crawling her clothing would be ready. She loved the new style that babies in the East were put into, and whether it was common there in the West or not she didn't know. But her baby would be dressed in the style of the East, and no one could challenge her about it. When she got back downstairs with the clothes, she stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs, watching Kane with the baby. He was so kind and gentle, and his hands were loving. His voice was low as he talked to the little girl, telling her that she wasn't allowed to even look at boys until she was 50. Berniece laughed softly as she stepped into the room. "Are you not going to allow her to go to school?" He turned to her with a grin. "I guess you heard that, huh?" "I did." 50? He shrugged. "Maybe 40. I'll see how it goes when I get there." He lifted the baby from the water and handed her to his wife, who waited with a towel. Drying her off completely, Berniece laid her on the table and diapered her, and then put her in her gown. "Are you ready for sleep, precious?" she asked softly. "We have church tomorrow, so it will be a busy day, and we get to see your Auntie Charlie." "Yes, we do. She's going to be so happy to get to hold you. We'll have to choose a day next week to go see her, too. I can do her mending, and she can hold you." "Why would you do Charlie's mending?" Kane asked with surprise. Berniece shrugged. "She hates mending, and I don't mind it, so I figured she could play with the baby, and I would do her mending. It's more of an excuse to spend a day with her. I've caught up on things around here, and other than making new clothes for the baby, there's not a lot for me to do." She frowned. "I don't want you to think I'm just wasting time." "I don't." Kane shook his head. "I know what this house would look like if you were just wasting time. You do a good job with Ruth, and you feed me constantly. The house is always immaculate. I think you've earned a couple days a week with Charlie." "Oh, good. I know that's been a sore spot in the past, and I don't want you to think I would ever not work hard. I just don't feel the need to scrub the floors every day. Once a week is enough." He smiled. "Once a week is more than enough. There's no need for you to do it more than that." He eyed the baby, who was now fully dressed for bed. "You'll give her a bottle and then put her in her crib?" Berniece nodded. "That's the nighttime ritual she had at Charlie's, and I've kept it going here." She seemed soothed by it. Let me give her the bottle, then. Is it ready? Yes, I'll get it for you. She liked taking care of the bedtime routine herself, but she understood how much he would want to take care of his daughter when he could. She gave him the bottle and walked into the parlor with them. Would you like me to read another poem or two while you feed her? He nodded. That would be wonderful if you really don't mind. Not at all. As she read, she watched him with the baby, always impressed by how good he was with her. He put her on his shoulder and burped her when she needed it, and then fed her a bit more. Finally, the baby fell asleep with the bottle still in her mouth, and he carefully took it out. I'm going to put her in her crib. Berniece nodded, reading the next poem as he left the room with the baby. When he came back a couple of minutes later, he sat down beside her and took the book from her, careful to mark its page with the piece of paper she had there, and then he closed it and put it on an end table. Taking both of her hands in his, he squeezed them. I think you're right. She frowned. I am? That's good to know. About what? I think we should have another baby. I think Ruth needs brothers and sisters, and I know I would love to have another child. What do you think? He asked. She stared at him for a moment, surprised that he would say something like that so abruptly. They hadn't even kissed, but once. I think it's definitely a part of our marriage I would like to explore, she said softly. Good. He pulled her to him and kissed her slowly and passionately. She was surprised that he was wanting to start the next baby so soon, but his kisses were intoxicating, and after a moment or two, she couldn't think at all. He raised his head, breathing heavily. Are you sure this is what you want? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Now that she could think again, she knew it wasn't the right time. I need to know about Veronica first. He sighed. I was afraid you'd feel that way. Soon. With that, he got up and walked away from her. She did need to know, but he wasn't sure how to tell her everything. It would happen though. It had to. Chapter 9. After church the following morning, the two couples went out to lunch with the baby. It was Bernice's first time to eat out since moving to Montana, and she was uncertain how she felt about it. We don't have to spend money, she whispered to Kane. I'm happy to invite everyone to our place, and I'll cook. He laughed softly. That's a good idea for next time, but we can afford to eat out on occasion. Don't worry so much. I think you need a break occasionally, just like I do. She was a little relieved that he had decided she'd worked enough to deserve a break. And after lunch, you're going to show me the ranch, she asked. She wanted time to talk to Charlie first and tell her she needed to know all there was to know about Veronica. Yes, if you still want to. I do. I want to help Charlie with something first, and then we can go. Oh, and I suppose we should ask her to take care of Ruth. He laughed. We shouldn't take her for granted, should we? Berniece looked at the woman next to her, who was watching her curiously. I'm going to show you how to do that thing after lunch, and then we were hoping you'd watch the baby. Charlie looked at her with a confused expression. Of course. And I can't wait to learn how to do the thing. She obviously had no idea what Berniece was talking about, and she shouldn't because there was no thing to show her. She just needed to talk to her. The cafe was small, but it was obviously busy. When the waitress came over, she smiled. I haven't seen you folks for a while. Been busy? Charlie nodded. Well, Berniece came in from Massachusetts to marry Kane, and now we don't need to really eat out much. The men were kind enough to give us a break by bringing us out to eat this afternoon. Sundays are good days to take breaks from cooking. The waitress held her notebook. Water? Coffee? Tea? Water for me, Berniece said. The waitress wrote all their orders down. Specials for everyone? When the other three nodded, Berniece nodded as well. As the waitress walked away, Berniece asked, "What's the special?" "Chicken and dumplings today," Kane said. "Whatever the special is, it's always the best food of the day, so that's what we always get." "I think you've eaten here a lot." Charlie sighed. "Before I came here, they ate out every single evening, and twice on Sunday." "Not even joking." "That's really sad," Berniece said, shaking her head. She didn't even want to think of all the money they'd wasted. Abel shrugged. "I can cook a few simple things, but I don't like to eat what I've cooked. Before Charlie came, I was a starving bachelor." Berniece raised an eyebrow. "Starving? Really?" "I might be exaggerating, but just a little bit," he said with a wink. She shook her head, laughing. "Well, I'm glad that no one eats here for every meal anymore." Looking at Charlie, she asked, "How's the morning sickness? Is it getting any better?" "Yes, finally. I thought I would spend the rest of my life with my head in a chamber pot. Thankfully, I can now eat breakfast again. Usually." Bernie smiled. "I'm glad you're feeling better. And I appreciate you being willing to watch Ruth this afternoon. Would you believe the only part of the ranch I've seen is the house? Kane is going to show me around today, and we thought it would be best to do it without the baby." Charlie nodded. "Are you walking or going by horseback?" "No idea." Berniece looked at Kane. "Do you have an answer to that?" Kane smiled. "We'll go on horseback. The ranch is much too big to do on foot. Not in one day at least. We could take 4 or 5, but we'd miss the baby." "Sounds good," she bit her lip. "My father believed that women shouldn't ride horseback, even with a side saddle. I'm not sure we can do this. I've never been on a horse." Kane shrugged. "We'll ride double, and you can cling to my manly chest and find yourself overrun with passion." Berniece turned beet red, and her jaw dropped. "Kane Burton, you cannot talk that way in front of other people." Charlie waved away her objection. "We're not other people. We're family. Besides, Abel would talk that way in front of other people if he thought I'd let him get away with it." Their water was brought over then, along with a couple of crackers for the baby. Ruth took them greedily, trying to shove a whole cracker in her mouth. Berniece shook her head and took the crackers away patiently. "That's too much, Ruth. You're going to choke." She broke them into smaller pieces and put just 2 pieces in front of the little girl, keeping the rest out of her reach. You'd think she hadn't eaten in a month. "She's always been a hungry baby," Charlie said, her eyes going soft as she talked about the baby, whom she obviously loved. "I almost feel bad for taking her away from you," Berniece said. "I can see how much you care about her." "She's having her own," Abel said softly. "And it's not like she never gets to see little Ruth. You bring her by often." "Oh, that reminds me. How would you feel if I brought Ruth over on Tuesday afternoon and I did some of your mending while you played with the baby? It would be something of a break for me, because it would be different work, and you wouldn't have to do your own mending." Charlie grinned. "I can only agree with that if you will allow me to fix supper for you to take home. Then Kane will be fed a good meal even though his wife is off working for no pay for his sister-in-law." Berniece made a face. "You don't have to do that. I can put a roast in the oven before I leave." "I won't take no for an answer," Charlie said adamantly. "Then I guess you're fixing our supper on Tuesday night." Kane smiled at the arrangement. He liked that the 2 women got along so well and were so willing to do things for one another. It was another thing that was different about Berniece and Veronica, but there were so many, he just needed to stop comparing them. When they returned to Charlie and Abel's house after lunch, Berniece took Charlie into the kitchen and sat down at the table with her. "I don't know what thing you're going to show me," Charlie said, "but I have a feeling what you really wanted was a private talk." "That's exactly what I want." Berniece lowered her voice to a mere whisper. I want to know everything you know about Kane's marriage with Veronica. He's ready to be intimate, and I don't want to take that step before I know exactly what he's hiding from me about his first wife. Charlie shook her head. I would tell you if I felt like I could, but I fear I've already said too much. You need to get Kane to open up about her. It seems too painful for him. Every time I try, he just closes up. He wanted to last night, but I told him I needed to know about Veronica first, and he went to bed alone rather than talk to me about her. Why won't he open up? You're doing the right thing by making him wait until he can talk about it, but I promise, what he's hiding is not intense feelings for Veronica. I've said too much already. You need to talk to him and get him to say whatever he needs to say. Berniece sighed, leaning back in her chair. I feel like the entire town is in on a secret that I know nothing about. It's time for someone to break the vow of silence. That someone really does need to be Kane and not me. I'm so sorry. I'd tell you anything else. I know you would. All right. I'll try to talk to him again today. We'll have plenty of time alone together. Good. Charlie got to her feet. Would you care to stay for supper tonight? Since you'll be out all day exploring, it might be nice to just know it's taken care of. Berniece pursed her lips as she thought about it. Only if you'll come to my house for supper on Saturday night. I'll cook a feast. I'll bring a pie. The apples are ripe, and it's the perfect time to bake an apple pie. Do you want to know something, Charlie? Sure. I like to know things. I think you're one of my favorite people in the world, and I'm sad I didn't know you when we were both growing up in Beckham. Charlie laughed. Have you heard the stories about the demon horde that plagued the country school outside of Beckham? Oh, yes. Berniece shook her head. There was a big family, and all of the children were monsters. I hear there are still a few that are causing mischief now. I'm one of the original demon horde members. Still wish we'd been friends? Berniece laughed after a moment of shock. Yes, I still do. I think your antics would have been fun to watch. I'm not so sure. Kane poked his head into the kitchen then. Are you ladies finished with your private talk? Charlie laughed. There's no pulling the wool over your eyes, Kane. Yes, we're finished. Take her away. Supper is here at 6 sharp. That way you can spend all day exploring, and your sweet wife won't have to worry about feeding you. You sure you don't mind? Kane asked. Not at all. And we're coming to your house on Saturday for supper, so don't think it's wrong of you to let me cook. Berniece is cooking for us in return. Kane smiled. You know too well how I think. He reached for Bernice's hand. Let's go see my ranch. I think you're going to be amazed by our operation. Well, now you have me confused, Kane. Is it yours or ours? Berniece grinned at him saucily. It's ours. Now, hush, and I'll tell you about it as we drive. On the way, he talked about the size of his ranch and how many head of cattle he ran. He had 25 men working for him, and only 3 were staying behind to help him during the cattle drive that was starting on Monday. How many cows are you selling? He grinned. I'm selling all the steers and keeping just 2 bulls. And I'm keeping most of the cows. I need them for breeding next year. That makes sense. I had no idea you had so many men working for you. Do you enjoy managing men? She asked. He shrugged. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. Last year, I had a couple of men who were competing for the same woman's affections. Everything they did was a contest to see who was better, and it made me just a little bit crazy. I felt like I spent more time keeping the 2 of them from killing each other and outdoing each other than I did working. And I'm sure it was hard when Veronica died. Did you have to take much time off work? He took a deep breath. I don't want to talk to you about Veronica, but after talking to Abel today, I can see that I need to. Why don't we go home and talk about everything you need to know, and then if we still have time before supper, I'll show you around the ranch. If we don't, we can do it next week. Snow's going to start soon, but you're a Massachusetts girl, and I would think you can withstand a little cold. She smiled. I probably can. I've been known not to freeze into a solid block of ice when winter came around. He grinned at her, but his mind was on the conversation they were about to have, a topic he'd hoped to never have to speak about with his new wife. She had to know, though. He would try really hard to keep her from paying for Veronica's sins in his mind, but she'd already suffered more than she should have to. It was time she knew why. When they got to the ranch, she went inside and made a pot of coffee while he unhitched the wagon. He spent a good 10 minutes talking to his dog, Clyde, trying to explain to him why this was so difficult for him, but Clyde just looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. He was on his own in that arena. Walking outside the stable, he spotted some late-blooming flowers that he couldn't give the name of if his life depended on it. He picked a small bouquet and took it inside to his wife. While she put the flowers in water and fussed a little, he drank coffee, trying to get up the courage to say what he needed to say to her. How did you tell a woman that he had been a terrible husband to his first wife, but she'd been an even worse wife? He wasn't sure it was possible to do it without losing his mind. Berniece sat down across from Kane at the table and waited for him to speak for more than a minute. Finally, she decided it was her job to start the conversation. So, I've gleaned a bit of information from things people have told me. Veronica didn't cook at all. And she didn't particularly care for cleaning either. I'm under the impression she expected everyone around her to do the things a wife should do while she sat back and watched. And then she died in childbirth, and everyone rallied around you to help the baby, but I can't even imagine what your emotions must have been like. Did you love her so much you just couldn't stand it? Kane grinned a little and shook his head. I'm going to have to start at the beginning, and this isn't a short story. But you need to know how it all came about. I think I do need to know, and I'm sorry I'm making you talk about such a difficult thing. She reached over and took his hand, squeezing it in her own. He took a deep breath and started talking, watching her carefully for any adverse reactions. The story was a difficult one. Chapter 10. Berniece was so happy Kane was finally willing to talk about Veronica she couldn't express it. She was determined to let him say what he needed to say, and she would simply listen to him. It didn't take her long to get angry as he told his story. Veronica lived in a small town near here, and her father was a banker. When he lost all his money, he gave her a piece of jewelry to sell, and she was on her own from that day forward. That wasn't Veronica's fault, of course, but it was how everything started. She moved into the hotel here in Missoula, and she set her sights on the richest man in town. When he made it clear he wasn't interested, she moved on to Abel. Abel? I had no idea there was ever a courtship between Veronica and Abel. Kane nodded, moving on. Abel was flattered that a woman so beautiful was interested in him. He stood up and walked over to a portrait of the baby, and he reached behind it in the frame, pulling out a picture of a beautiful woman. She had blonde hair and looked particularly fetching in the dress she was wearing. Taking it to his wife, he handed it to her. Veronica had a way of making any man feel 20 feet tall when she turned her gaze on him and acted like she was interested in a relationship. And their relationship didn't last? He shook his head. She continually talked to him about marriage, and he finally told her he didn't think they would be compatible. I didn't know he'd told her that, and I'd met her a few times, gone to supper with them, that sort of thing. I found out later that he had thought about hosting a supper party, and he asked her if she would be willing to make the meal. She had laughed in response, telling him that she'd never be willing to do the job of servants, but she would be happy to cling to his arm and play hostess. Berniece nodded. I can't see Abel being willing to be put up with someone like that. He wasn't. Honestly, if I'd had a chance to talk to him, I wouldn't have been willing either. He shrugged. I went into town the next morning to get some supplies. At that point, I was eating with my men every night, and I was there getting the food we needed for meals. When I got to the store, I found her there, and she was crying. I didn't know better, so I went over to try to soothe her. Well, of course. You knew her, and she was new to town. Right. Well, I'd always thought she was beautiful, and my brother was the luckiest man in all Montana for having her as his sweetheart. I asked her if she was all right, and she threw herself into my arms. She told me that she and Abel had a fight because she told him that she had feelings for me, and he had yelled at her. I couldn't picture it, but I knew that if anyone could make him angry, it was her. You either wanted to love her or hate her. She said she had nowhere to go and told me about her father losing all his money. So, you asked her to marry you and did it right then before you talked to Abel. Am I that transparent? Kane asked, shaking his head. I was happy for exactly 3 hours before I found out how she really was. We went to the church, married, and then I took her out for lunch, and she was so sweet. When I got her home, she took one look around my house and asked me why I expected her to live in filth. Then she asked when I was hiring a maid. Berniece had the strange desire to laugh at that, but she held it in. She couldn't imagine Kane being married to anyone who wasn't willing to work. Oh my. He grinned at her. I guess that explains why I was so worried you'd end up being a wastrel. He sighed deeply. We managed to live together for all of a week, when she borrowed some of my money that I had left out for household expenses and went back to the hotel. She stayed there for around a month before she came back to me and informed me she was carrying my child and she didn't want it. He could still see how her face looked as she told him how much she wished she'd never conceived the baby. Berniece shook her head. I can't imagine a mother not wanting her own child. Of course, you can't. You want another woman's child, and the fact that you didn't give birth to her doesn't bother you even a little bit. No, it doesn't. She sighed. She sounds like someone I would want to slap. Kane laughed softly. I did want to slap her often. But I never did, and I think I should get some sort of medal for that. Well, I used to think so. He shook his head. She moved back in with me, and we did our best to make things work, but she was constantly telling me that I couldn't expect her to do any kind of work, because she was expecting. I couldn't ask her to cook or clean or even be kind to people. She was pregnant, and she was always sore and hurting. Berniece understood the knowing look she'd gotten around town when people found out she was married to Kane. I've thought this whole time that you loved her so much you couldn't speak about her. I never loved her. I was infatuated by her for a few hours. When she died, I felt terrible, because the baby was mine, and she'd died in childbirth, and I couldn't bring myself to be horribly sad she'd died. The guilt has truly overwhelmed me. She wasn't a pleasant or loving person, but she did give me my child. She gave her life for little Ruth, and I need to always respect her for that. Respecting her and mourning her are two very different things. I know that if I had married Albert Chase and he had died a short while later, I would have felt only relief. I couldn't have mourned him. No, I don't suppose you could have. Kane sat down again, and he grasped her hand. You don't think less of me? She shook her head adamantly. How could I think less of you for that? He pulled her to her feet and walked into the parlor with her. I want you to tell me exactly what happened with Albert Chase now. Berniece took a deep breath. You know most of it. My whole life I was aware of the man, because he came over to dinner often, and he was always looking at me as if I belonged to him. He made me feel extremely uncomfortable. If I knew he was coming for supper, I would do my best to go to a friend's house so I didn't have to see him. Or I'd pretend to be sick and stay in my room without eating. Kane frowned. Men shouldn't make girls feel that way. No, they shouldn't. I always thought of him as an old man. I guess I really became aware of the fact he was my father's boss when I was about 5, and already he made me feel bad about myself. The day I turned 19, I went home fully expecting a birthday party. My parents had said they would have a surprise for me when I got home from the orphanage. Instead of a party, he was there. He asked me to be his wife, and I said no. I didn't even have to think about it. Of course, you didn't. She smiled. My father didn't give me the choice. He grabbed me by the shoulder, took me into his office, and told me in no uncertain terms that since I hadn't found a husband by myself, then he had taken the matter into his own hands, and he'd arranged a marriage for me. I was to go out and tell Mr. Chase that I would marry him and beg his forgiveness for my rudeness. Did you? Not immediately. It took some convincing and some threats, but finally I did what he said. I apologized, and Albert laughed as if it was all a big joke. He walked me to the door, and he kissed me. Well, he would have called it a kiss, but I would have called it a molestation of my mouth. She shuddered. I was told the next morning that I needed to stop going to the orphanage, because it was time for me to start planning my wedding. It became my job to shop and plan my wedding. Once every week, Albert would take me out for dinner and kiss me, telling me what my duties would be as his wife. He shook his head. He sounds like such a pleasant man. He was worse than you're imagining. Anyway, a few days before I left, he took me to supper, and I asked him why he didn't want to marry someone closer to his age. He was extremely angry when I said that, and he told me he would punish me. He wasn't sure how, but he would come up with a good way to do it, and he would tell me the next time he saw me. He wouldn't punish me until our wedding night, though, because then I would be his. She shuddered as she told him everything. He wanted me to know what the punishment was so I could think about it for the 2 months leading up to our wedding. And did you tell your parents? He was more disgusted by her story than he'd imagined he'd be. Actually, when he took me home that night, he told my father he would have to find a way to punish me, and they laughed about it. And then my parents left the room so we could spark. As if I wanted that odious old man touching me. I tried to talk to my mother the next morning, and she wouldn't do anything, so I went for a walk and ended up at the Mercantile looking at books, as I always did. There I saw an advertisement I'd seen for years, but never even thought about, until that moment. And I went and talked to Elizabeth Tandy, Charlie's older sister. Elizabeth listened to my story, and she found a way to get me on a train less than 48 hours later. I'm glad you had the courage to go to her. Berniece nodded. I am, too. All I could think about was getting away from that man. My mother wouldn't help me. My father thought it was a good idea. I had to take matters into my own hands, or in my case, put matters in Elizabeth's hands. He leaned back on the sofa and wrapped his arm around her. If I were a writing sort, I would need to write a book about Veronica and Albert and how well they would have done together. Oh, that's mean. But yes, that's a book I would read. She looked over at him. Thank you for telling me all that about Veronica. I can see where it wouldn't be something you want your new wife to know, but I could tell there was something I didn't know every time I met a new person in town. Does this mean we can move forward now? He was afraid to look at her as he asked the question. He wanted a real marriage with her, where she did all the things she'd been doing and she shared his bed. That last part was becoming more important by the day. I would like that a lot. Berniece took a deep breath, considering telling him she loved him right then, but she wanted to make a big deal out of it. She would make a special supper, and she'd tell him over dessert, as he was marveling at her cooking prowess. Me too. He glanced at a clock on the wall. We've been talking for a very long time. We need to get back to town for supper and so we can bring our daughter home. Yes, we do. She got to her feet and smiled down at him. I'm so glad we talked about these things. I feel like we really can move on now. I do, too. He got to his feet and drew her against him, kissing her softly. Thank you for not thinking less of me. Well, you could have thought less of me, too. We'll let bygones be bygones, and we can talk about the people who have been so rude to us if we want to. She rested her forehead against his shoulder. I feel like a load has been lifted off my shoulders. I'm not sure if it's because you told me about Veronica, or if it's because I told you everything about Albert. Either way, I'm glad we had this talk. But I do want to see the ranch sometime. He smiled. I know. You'll get to see the ranch. He walked out to hitch up the team, feeling a lot lighter himself. Berniece was good for him. Asterisk. After her laundry the following day, Berniece made a special supper for Kane. She wanted to tell him she loved him in the nicest way she could think of. She made steak, baked potatoes, and green beans, knowing that he was particularly fond of steak. When he came in at the end of the day, he looked as if he'd just combed his hair back and he had more flowers in his hand. I can't pick them after the snow starts, and it could come any day. Farmer's Almanac is calling for an early winter. She walked to him and stood on tiptoe to kiss him. Thank you. They're lovely. While he washed his hands and played with Ruth, she arranged the flowers in a vase and put them beside the other, thinking about how overrun with flowers her house was about to be if he kept this up. How was your day? He rubbed the back of his neck tiredly. The men are off for the cattle drive, and we moved the rest of the herd down to the river. Sounds interesting. It wasn't a lot of fun, but little of ranch work is. I do love to be outdoors, and I love the animals. And the money isn't too terribly bad. He smiled at her. Did she crawl today? Berniece laughed, shaking her head. She neither crawled nor spoke. You're good for another day. Glad to hear it. She put the food in front of him before sitting down and cutting off a small piece of her potato to cool for Ruth. After the prayer, she mashed it up and mashed a few green beans, mixing them together. This is going to be nummy. Kane didn't think it was possible to love a woman as much as he loved Berniece at that moment. She'd spent the day taking care of his baby, made his favorite meal, cleaned house, and now she was talking to the baby as if she were the most important person in her world. I love you. Bernice's head turned toward him, and her eyes grew wide. Did you just say what I think you said? He chuckled. How could I not love someone who gives so much of herself to everything she does? I made this meal special so I could tell you that I love you while you ate it, and here you are saying it before I even get a chance. Do you mean it? You really love me? I really do love you, Kane Burton. And I hope we have many happy years together and a dozen children. He frowned. As long as your births are easy with all of them. She shrugged. I'm not worried about dying in childbirth. With our modern medicine, it's happening less and less. All right. After the baby was in bed, he took her into his arms, looking down into her eyes. Since we love each other, how about sleeping in my bed tonight? I really kind of expected you to last night, but you went to your old room. You didn't ask me to sleep with you, so I thought you wanted me in my old room. If you say what's on your mind, we'll communicate a lot more clearly. He smiled at that. Berniece, I would really enjoy it if you would move into my room and let me make love to you. She laughed. Now that was clear. I'd be happy to. Epilogue. A year and a half later, Berniece was sitting up in bed, sweat still on her forehead as she stared into the eyes of a tiny baby boy. The midwife had just left, and Kane was sitting beside her. He's beautiful. And you're still alive. I told you I was going to be fine, she said, shaking her head at him. Should we bring Ruth in to see the baby? He nodded, going to get their little girl, who was in the kitchen with her Aunt Charlie baking cookies. Ruth had grown into a beautiful little girl with blonde ringlets, looking more like her mother than he'd ever dreamed she would, but her disposition was just like Bernice's. She'd learned a great deal from her stepmother. When Ruth walked in, her eyes were wide with surprise. "It's a boy?" she asked. Charlie must have told her. "Yes, it's a boy. What do you think we should name him?" Ruth wrinkled her little nose. "George?" she asked. Bernice knew there was a little boy named George at the church she liked to speak with. "How about if we call him Seth? It's a strong Bible name, and it goes well with Ruth." Bernice looked at Kane for his reaction. "That sounds good to me. We'll keep on going with the Bible names." "Mommy?" Ruth asked, and Bernice's heart swelled, as it did every time the little girl called her that. "Yes, Ruth? Love you." Ruth climbed onto the bed beside her and rested her head on her mother's shoulder as she looked down at her little brother. Bernice looked at her children and then over at her husband, and she knew that her life had never felt so complete. "I love you, too, Ruth. And I love your daddy, and I even love little Seth." Kane walked over and squatted in front of Bernice, looking at the baby. His whole world was right there in that room with him, and he couldn't be happier.